In this episode of the Airs for Architecture podcast, I was joined by Charlotte Malterre-Barthes, architect, urban designer, and assistant professor of architectural and urban design at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, Lausanne, or EPFL. Charlotte joined me to discuss her recent book, A Moratorium on New Construction, number 14 in Sternberg Press's Critical Spatial Practices series, published in February this year.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture, and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Airs for Architecture. I'm talking today to Charlotte Malterre-Barthes, writer, architect, academic. Charlotte, thank you so much for joining me. We're going to be talking about your very recent book, A Moratorium on New Construction, and it's a very controversial and provocative book. I'm very grateful for you being here, so thank you for that. But before we get into that, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks for having me. So I am an architect, an educator, and also an activist. So I also add that to the definition. And I'm currently an assistant professor of architecture and urban design at EPFL in Lausanne.
Fantastic. How did you get into architecture? Did you go through the whole rigmarole of 5 years of training and...
Absolutely. I got a very classical training because I graduated from the National Architecture School of Marseille, which for anyone would know that it stands in the shadow of the Cité Radieuse of Corbusier. So a day wouldn't pass in university without that being referenced, and I think it took me another 20 years to deconstruct that. So a kind of classical training. I also studied 2 years in Vienna, which maybe, kind of saved me from the all modernist nostalgia kind of education. And then I practiced. So I also have quite a solid knowledge on construction. I built and I was what is referred to today as an architectural worker for about 7 years before I branched out into academia. I also tend to sit discomfortably between theory and practice. So I also still practice, in fact, and then there is this question of what's a practice, right? The book, for instance, is in the critical spatial practice. So the kind of dichotomy between theory and practice is not something that I enjoy particularly. So I try to sit in that discomfortable space, and I think that's what also that book is trying to bridge.
Could you talk about that a little bit? That's a very interesting idea, this discord between theory and practice. And I've heard architects speak about this. What do you mean? And how is that revealed, I suppose, in the context that you're in, which is Central Northern Europe?
It's funny because it kind of it has multiple layers. So on the one hand, is an architect that does not build is considered like a doctor who doesn't cure or doesn't practice. So it's actually quite derogatory in certain spaces. So in Northern Europe, an architect is someone who builds, and there is also this kind of very dumb, I think, way of seeing this is that the ones who think can't build and the one who builds can't think, which I think is kind of very stupid and not really helpful. And so I think that in this kind of realm in which I sit, that comes with a gender element on top of that, where basically a lot of educators and people who are more spatial practitioners, to kind of use that term, are people who are, in academic realms or do forms of practice that are fringing cultural production or more, let's say, adjacent to construction, hardcore construction. So the act of, piling materials one over the other towards a building. And that's still in the hands of, let's say, male-driven practices. So the kind of ratio of practicing architect has been also skewed towards male practitioners. It's also still male practitioners that own or that conduct or that are partners in offices. So it's still something that's very gendered. So when you typically interrogate construction, this is something that I also have heard many times, that basically I'm in an ivory tower and I have no idea what I'm talking about, which is of course not true. And that's why I really try to kind of, interrogate that divide.
Do you feel this divide is something that's particularly present now? Is it always at the heart of what we see as architectural production? Has it been a motif of the modern period? Has there been a moment at which this divide between thinking and making, if that's a fair division, has been less manifest?
I think so. I mean, I'm not an architecture historian. It's something I would leave to others to kind of tackle more in depth. But my understanding of this kind of divorce between thinking and building is something that you don't find with the emergence of the Renaissance architects and all of that, which are people who would also claim intellectual presence, right? So they would also, the architect as this kind of Renaissance figure is a kind of omniscient figure, right? It's somebody who can paint, it's somebody who can draw, it's somebody who can do sculptures, and somebody who can also design buildings and potentially be on construction site and even direct the construction site, like someone like Brunelleschi, for instance, who's known to be a dreadful site conductor, from what I gather. In the works of Sergio Ferro, for instance, in this wonderful Architecture from Below book that was published recently, there's a lot on that. So I don't think that it's a fatality. It's probably correct what you say, that there is a kind of emphasis on that based on let's say in the context of modernity, and that kind of I mean, it's stupid. I don't think that the ones who build can't think, and also, why do you assume that people who think can't build? It's also kind of dumb. I think it kind of allows to keep critique at bay to a certain extent. That would be my analysis of that.
Where does this book, A Moratorium on New Construction, come from in your own work? I obviously get a sense of it. Your comments about Marseille and Le Corbusier suggest an ambivalence at best about the high modernist project and its legacy in our own cities and urban sphere. And if I read you correctly, Vienna is the sort of antidote, in a way, in your own learning to that. And then there's this idea, of course, of the highly gendered problematic at the heart of architectural design practices. So I think it's kind of clear what you see the problem as being. Maybe we can unpack that a little further. But where does this book come from? What's the scholarship that underpins it?
So I think there may be two strands. On the one hand, there would be what you identified as the personal kind of background and all the things that fuel one's interest towards something. So I retrospectively, in a way, traced back this kind of discomfort with construction as something that happened really early in my own path. I remember discussing with a colleague in university that we should probably think twice about what we build. I'm talking about like 2004 or something like that, so quite far out. And that person mentioning to me that wonderful project from La Caton-Vassal, which is 96, I believe, the Place Léon Aucuc, which is a project one with the fact that basically it's a project one on Excel sheet, saying instead of redoing the entire public space, you can just kind of update the maintenance protocols and you will have a perfectly functioning space without doing anything. And then kind of understanding that this too is part of the work of architects as something that is a kind of almost like a proto seed for that project, but also identifying it as something that I've defined for myself as like underground rivers of interest that tend to come out at time, right? They're always there, but then they have resurgences and they come out in the open at certain moments. I think that's one of these moments. I also found an article from 2016 of mine called To Build or Not to Build, the Ethics of Architecture, which I had actually forgotten about that piece. And it's very interesting because it's a piece that's more about like the social ethics, what do we build? So it's about like constructing prisons, constructing in dictatorship. So it's more kind of moral positioning, which, I'm not necessarily saying I still stand by that, because I think morality is always a bit of contentious position, but there are these kind of, let's say, doubts, I would say, that are present across my own path. I also actually quit the last office I was working in because they had asked me to basically pour concrete over a field while I had carefully designed a densification project on the other side of the street that would just kind of, increase the density of an existing urban core. And they were like, we need more square meter for the Excel sheet. Put, square meters on the field across the streets. And I was like, well, I mean, that's not what I want to do. And then that was like the last draw of my quitting, in fact, in this situation. So I think there are kind of strands of personal interest and doubts and trying to articulate for myself my own, discomfort again with aspects of construction. And then there is basically the entire systemic question. So that's where the pandemic becomes a really useful intellectual moment where, and I use the Latour text that he put out in the middle of the pandemic, which says, like we've been able to stop so many things, so many aspects of our system has been, put on hold, and therefore we can actually change a lot. And then it became very clear that while a lot of things had stopped, construction was not one of those. And I think it really emerged as a kind of such a striking fact. And I think that's one of the moments where the kind of articulation of the idea of a moratorium or something that would be a pause as a project was emerging. And maybe something that matters, I think, is the fact that the idea itself was not matured into the book. So I didn't sit with that, in my room and kind of try to make sense of it and publish the book, but I actually made it a public debate tool, and also a kind of pedagogical tool to keep on thinking about this together with others. So there were a round of 4 roundtables with people from around the world, because very quickly emerged this idea of like, who are you to call for a moratorium on new construction? You white woman. At the time I was at Harvard, so in an Ivy League school, who tells to people they can't build. So this was attacked. It was also, kind of contentially taken. So the roundtables were really useful to kind of try to make sense of this. A lot of it is also in the book, in fact. So talking with like various people who had very different position on architecture, from Cairo, Japan, Nubia, really South Africa, you name it. So it was really about like gathering more complex views on that, which I think also are found their way in the book, and then bringing this to the teaching table. So what does it actually mean to teach not to? And that was also an incredibly enriching process. That's also the moment where the topic of the moratorium was brought into, at the time, Twitter, and was kind of destroyed. And I think it was also interesting to see what people had against it. So it also kind of illustrated this YIMBY, NIMBY kind of situation where the ones who don't want to build are always on the kind of conservative corners and are, opposed to construction for all the wrong reasons, because it's kind of something for affordable housing or things like that, or how, environmental agendas can be instrumentalized. So I think those things were actually very useful to try to kind of articulate further what a moratorium on new construction could be so I located between these thought experiments as a way to kind of also say, well, you can decide to take it just as that, but also as a call to action. Like if you decide to take it as a much more serious tool, both is basically possible. you should try it with your parents or with like people who have nothing to do with architecture. It's always very interesting if you say, well, we should stop building. They're like, but what about your profession? And then usually you can start to unpack it. So it's very efficient as a kind of conversational and thought-provoking tool. So I think that works beyond expectation. And then, unpacking what it actually means. So once you say, okay, stop building, but what after? Like I think that's when the real work actually starts. So what needs to change so that we could potentially start building again?
You've used these two words, construction and building, and I want to come on to that in a second. But your book at the beginning presents this axiom: to build is to destroy. This is a provocative statement. Can you explain a little bit what you mean by that? I suppose, superficially at least, you're arguing that the processes of construction and the supply chains and material production and delivery is an inherently anti-environmental, anti-ecological perhaps, process, and therefore is always deeply wedded to the idea of destruction. Is that right?
Yes, I guess to a certain extent. But yes, in fact, to build is to destroy, because in the way that construction happens today, so I'm talking about like modern, Western forms of construction, or like the way that we build in 90% of the way is destructive because of the materials that you use, but also because of the where you build and how you build. So I think that's clear to me. It's not something that the profession has really come to term with. I think we tend to contend with harm. So we think about what is the least harmful potentially, but yes, to build is to destroy. You will not manage to build something without destroying something else. That's very clear.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's why when you say it's very provocative, I actually tend to disagree. I think that's a fact. To build is to destroy. You will destroy something when you build something, always. There are less contentious ways of construction, of course. So there is, if you think about earth-based construction and things like that, they are less damaging and they are more in tune with, limiting whatever it is that you actually destroy. So I'm not talking about maybe like all the kind of bio-based construction material that exists that I think can, to a certain extent, mitigate the harm that we do when we construct.
There's an interesting anthropology, it seems to me, at the heart of this, which is that nature itself, or the ecology itself, is in some way adequate and perfect, and that human action is somehow subversive to that perfection, which is very different, say, for example, to an idea, say, for example, from the medieval period, from Abbot Suger at Saint-Denis, who sees the process of making as a consolidation, in fact, perhaps even a perfecting of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, for me, there's this relationship to materials as well, that a tree is beautiful, but a polished and sculpted piece of wood is more beautiful still. So for me, that is kind of challenging. That's why I say controversial, perhaps.
Yeah, no, I hear you, and I think it's worth to kind of to kind of think about what that actually means. So to me, it's more. I like to go back to like Donna Haraway and the this kind of definition of that she uses, and I can't remember the. I think it's probably in the Cyber Manifesto, but the fact that we use nature to form culture as a kind of straight line between this kind of potential idea that nature is perfect. So I personally don't subscribe to the idea that nature is perfect. I just like to think about how we look at nature as something that is at our disposal. So it's not so much about whether it's perfect or not. I don't really enter into that kind of value system. I think it's more that we think that it's there to be used towards what we need. And I think that this is where I would demand more caution, which I don't think we have at the moment. I think we just use completely freely, despite, greenwashing narratives, all of the earth as our kind of pool of resources to be used. So whether they're perfect or not, I mean, nature has been so modified already by humans that I would not even think about that in that way, but I object the fact that we consider it as kind of a free grab kind of library of materials that we can just take. And I have somewhere in the book there is a list of 40 verbs, and I had to stop at one point, that are actions that define actions of transforming materials towards something else. So, shredding and all of that. So I'm not, annealing all the stuff that we do with all these materials that actually just gives you, let's say, culturally, a hint toward the way that we perceive all of the earth as our kind of, just like resource library of sorts. And I think that this is maybe what I mean by, saying to build is to destroy, because in order to do that, you will, take and undo something else.
Do you also mean in this idea of destruction, the destruction of existing heritage, urban realms, building cultures? Or is it specifically orientated towards ecology?
Yeah, that's very interesting. So I also think that demolition is a problem. So not only, so that would put me in the conservative corners, but anyone who would really dive into the book would see that that's actually more complicated than that. Because, for instance, the idea of preservation and all of that is something that's like also very grounded in systems of value. Like, who decides that certain things have more value than others is also something that is grounded in a kind of class and cultural evaluation value system. So I think, Bourdieu and the idea that, not every culture has the same, wealth or value, and therefore what needs to be preserved. I think this is highly instrumentalized in a lot of contexts where, in the US, for instance, the kind of the sites of certain battles are considered to be like highly, precious, while, sites of Black cultures are being, kind of mercilessly erased, for instance. So I'm not sitting on the corner that says, preservation is the key. I think everything is heritage. So this is something that I kind of try to advocate for. So the idea that everything is heritage, in the sense that there is a need to reevaluate these value systems. And if you think about heritage as something that is not just cultural, but also, carbon and all of these kind of more soft, beyond carbon, but the kind of soft factors of value, then urban renewal, for instance, is known to be, the kind of one of the most politically charged, term, and the entire destruction of areas are typically related to the income or to the population that sits on that. So that's why I want to complexify that question. I think that the question of preservation is and needs to be, also complexified.
Yes, in one of the provocations I sent to you, I do raise this, for me, important point, which is that it's okay to talk about a moratorium on new construction when the place that you live is okay. But for a lot of people, the over 1 billion people in the world, for example, who live in informal settlements, with very substandard services, both public and physical, a total lack of representation as a consequence within political spheres, and therefore few rights, to use David Schlossberg, we get this problem, which is that processes of destruction, or destruction, are actually hugely advantageous. And I'm minded here of a very interesting little clip I saw of the last residence of Robin Hood Gardens in London, which was a brutalist housing block that was demolished to make way for, I don't know, other housing by other people. And the last resident was quite okay with the destruction. She was a poor woman of ethnic minority heritage, and she was fine with them knocking it down because it was bloody awful. How do we square this moratorium that you propose with those folk who need existentially better places to live?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think there are more than one question.
I do that. I do this as a speciality.
You tend to do that. So I will also answer, or let's say maybe propose some path to kind of give you some answer on how I see these things. So maybe first the question of, informal settlements and, the kind of rising population question and all of that. So again, I think that there is a need to kind of to be more nuanced on these questions, because if you look at the numbers of a city like Cairo, which I happen to been doing substantial research on what is called spontaneous settlements, there are 12 million vacant units in Cairo alone. And that means that the space that is available doesn't go to the people who need it. So I, of course, obviously in this moratorium on new construction, target primarily real estate residential development or state-led residential development. In the case of Cairo, for instance, there is a new capital being built with thousands of square meters of office space and villas that remain unused and vacant, for instance, because it's the result of an economic system that is siphoning public money directly into private pockets. For instance, as an example, it doesn't have to happen in Egypt alone. By the way, there are many other ways. I can talk about my own context, Marseille, where Euro-Méditerranée is a giant urban renewal project for the waterfront of the city, which basically use legal instruments to seize ownership of small ownership. So they just use, expropriation law to kind of scrap entire areas of the city with the kind of argument that they are building more density, more, quality housing. For who? It's always the same. So the people who actually live in these areas are expelled. They have to move out of the city. And the people who get there are more like, let's say, upper middle class citizens. So I think it's a question of like, for whom do we build, right? I think ultimately there is that. And then I think it's also important to kind of nuance a certain idea that, what is being constructed in places that, have a rising population goes to the people who actually need this housing. So the Chinese example is very clear. You have basically a bubble of construction, real estate, wealthy people would be maybe using that to park their money, to be safe, but people who actually need housing will not access this housing. It remains empty anyway. So or the same goes with like places like I'm gonna reference Costa Rica, I think, where like most of the construction that happens is actually waterfront condos that goes to expats or as capital parking. So I think there is a need to kind of also interrogate, there's this beautiful book, Elite Capture by Olifa Moteo, that actually discussed that and, speaks of the nuances. So what you see, what construction, what the industry of construction produces is not for the people that you refer to when you talk about informal housing. I prefer to use spontaneous. And also spontaneous housing has, kind of been partially at times infiltrated by forces of capital. Again, I go back to Cairo, where you find, one-off towers that are built overnight that also remain empty above the 6th floor because people only buy it to park money and they don't want to. 6th floor is the limit that you can go without an elevator, and elevators are not trusted. So people would not move on floors that are above 6. So they just buy and leave it as, securities. I'm expanding this because all I want to say is that I think there is a need to really be a little bit more critical about this idea that new construction will alleviate and solve questions of housing for the populations who need it. I think that's really something that I would like to really, put into question, not everywhere, but I think that there's a lot of places where what is being constructed is not actually what people are able to afford even and move into. So there is that. And then the second part of your question, which I think is really very important to also this discussion on the moratorium on new construction, is what about taking care of the spaces we already have? So the example of Robin Hood, I mean, it's a bit, it's not a very fair example because it's an example that kind of, touches upon the kind of canonized modernist massive housing. It's kind of going into this direction, but and then those buildings have some issues, but others are perfectly sound. I mean, I worked on Le Mirail in Toulouse, which is a beautiful modernist estate by Candice Rosic Woods, also a Team 10 member, like the Robin Hood designers that you mentioned. And those buildings are absolutely, kind of beautifully designed. And the main thing they suffer from is a lack of maintenance, because it speaks to also the way that authorities deal. Those are public housing, so deals with its pool of social housing. It basically opens up the can of worm of who is responsible for housing its population. Overwhelmingly, we've seen the state basically handing that over to the private and basically not taking care of its existing stock. And then, I mean, it has been perfectly unpacked in the book of Danny Abramson, Obsolescence. Is basically the idea that something cannot be saved, and the only solution will be to demolish. So what you say with this woman saying, Robin Hood, maybe the street on the sky was not such a great idea after all. But if the building is maintained, if it's kind of renovated, if there are kind of mitigation towards, heat and cool, if there are ways to kind of modernize and kind of take care of the estates, then it will be fine. I give you an example here, wealthy context, a state that, or like a city that takes care of its small housing, public housing estates. You have towers that are from the 70s that are, being renovated as we speak. So, it's really a question of like, how do we value our existing stock? So yes, we can build some, but how about taking care of what we already have and thinking about redistribution of the space that we don't actually use, right? So I think that this is why I'm always kind of, bringing forth this kind of attempt at mitigating the idea that we need to build more.
Fair enough. I'm minded in Britain that there's 2.5 million households with more than one house, and yet we have to build 1.5 million houses. I can square that circle very easily, although I probably come across as a communist.
No, but this is about political courage. So I think that this also, there is this idea of, if you need affordable housing, the only way that you're going to achieve that is by building more units. But actually, if there was a kind of rethinking of the existing square meters as something that is more of a common portfolio, I call it I think the kind of term that I try to kind of bring forth is that this kind of human portfolio of habitat that we have. So there is all the spaces that we have. And if we were to look at this with the urgencies that we should, then we could look at redistribution schemes, and they don't have to be about spoliation, right? It doesn't always have to be about coercive, horrible ways to kind of like, kind of Lenin moves where people have to share three, one apartment for 3 households and things like that. I think that that could be designed in a much more sensitive way where, but what about people who are living in like units where they're alone and their kids moved out 20 years ago and they're living in, my mother has like basically 2 houses side to side because she was like, I can't bother. And, you could think, well, maybe you could share, I don't know. And what are the incentives, so I think it's really, we're all guilty in the end of this, right? I think that it's also like something that I would like to bring forth, because it's always kind of, that's the question of morality. First of all, I don't claim purity myself, but I also think that it's important that we also think about our building stock as something that is our common portfolio. So how do we deal with that?
Could we talk a little bit about this difference that you pick out between construction and building? Seems to be at the heart of what you're talking about. A moratorium on new construction, but not necessarily on new building. And I suppose that then opens up for us designers an opportunity to think about what our role might be in relation to this.
Yes, I think building, what is it that we would need to build further when we stop constructing like the way we do? So I think it's also, of course, about thinking of organizations or about like larger conversations of how we can take a part in this. I think so. I have actually a lot of faith into architecture as a profession, in the sense that I find it a really powerful practice. I use the term conversational practice. I don't think it's in the book, but it's something that I'm kind of sitting with at the moment, is the idea that architects are really at the threshold of many bodies, many knowledges, many forms of awareness that would allow us to actually deploy much more of this building capacity. So an architect would know about construction laws, would know about material capacities, would know about floor plan, layouts, how people live, but would know about like also kind of referential canons and all of that, at the same time discussing with the client to kind of convince the person that maybe you need a little bit less than what they actually ask for, being knowledgeable about like the kind of construction, like contractors realities, when to build, the kind of time frames of construction, the liabilities questions, and the financing of the project and all of that. So I think that it's a profession that's really organizational and conversational in nature, also located very interestingly amidst construction processes. So somewhere at the point where the project really comes to life and how it can be then handed over. And I think that there is a lot to do with that. I also, looping back to this question on maintenance, I think that also architects would have a role to play in taking care of the existing much more than we do today, and not just preservation, as I mentioned, but like much more, reparative or adaptive task. You go back to a building every 5 years, you look at how it performs, you kind of suggest changes, you get paid for that, right? So I think there's also the question of like, how do you get to your money, and the need for reconsidering the calculation of honoraria as well, of course. So all of that. So I think it's that's maybe where I find the kind of construction versus building interesting. I think that there's also a lot of things to do in terms of like organization. How do we organize as a profession, everything that relates to like unionizing and things like that, as also being part of this need for building versus construction, so that we can also be much more able to press different agendas. This is all based on the premise, which I think is something that I also have to contend with, that we are good people, that we will be trying to do the right thing, which in my perspective is the case. I think that it's a discipline that's kind of interesting also because of its connection to humanities, and is also quite aware of the kind of urgencies of today, especially the generation that I deal with, which are basically panicked with what's going on, and panicked also by how little we're doing about that. So maybe that would be my way of answering this kind of construction versus building as a kind of future.
Is there also a sense in the notion of building of a more situated, piecemeal and earthbound process, a sort of Heideggerian idea around making, or a phenomenological idea around the way that we start thinking about the product that we make? So rather than thinking about it in the kind of somewhat alienating way that we think about design, and this comes again to the way that we educate, where we deal in abstract systems primarily, rather we should be relocating our design imaginations in the extractive processes that the realization of our design depends upon.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the tasks that this book has set for itself is to eliminate the distance between, for instance, design choices and extractive processes. So the fact that the kind of externalities that comes with making should not be perceived as such, but should be basically immediate. So I think there, I find really interesting the idea that you would think of making as something that is not just externalized and done by others, but something that is actually part and parcel of your decision at the very early stage of design. And also, again, this idea that you don't subject matter to your will, but that you actually contend with the limitation of matter and adjust your designs, for instance. So I think that this is the question, this is where the questions of processes comes into play, and that I find particularly exciting, and that I test also with my students. And I can tell you that we are basically not equipped to do that. So the idea that you think of something that is to be made as part of a process based on the material qualities or on the material limitation versus subjecting something to your design is something that we still haven't really started engaging with.
For sure. CLT, the craziest material ever invented.
Friends doing beautiful work with CLT, but it's literally that, no? It's like, you will submit matter to my will, and they do really cool stuff with it, but like it's literally that. It's like, I will make you perform the way I want. Yeah. I think steel is also incredible, like if you think of, I also, one of my favorite go-to example is the Walt Disney concert hall with this kind of absurd, I mean, Gary in any case has that kind of kind of intrinsically desire to submit matter to form in a way that is kind of really striking. So CLT also one of these fantastic formaldehyde based material.
I know. I mean, goodness me, the future generations, the generation of architects that we are educating are going to be picking up the pieces of that so much. That and expanded foam insulation, that is going to be such a crisis. Such a crisis. But I was just, as you were talking about the Disney Center, I was thinking about the project by Zaha Hadid in Wolfsburg, where you've got this glorious slippery outside. And then you look at the structure on the inside, and it's just about extraordinary quantities of steel. Amazing quantities of straight bits of steel. A lot of the examples that you cite come from outside traditional Western architecture. What do we learn from these things? And I suppose, to be critical, this is a very old story. This is a very colonial story. Graham Greene said, we travel to foreign countries to see poor people in other places. And that kind of is at the heart of this kind of grand tour of spontaneous settlements, indigenous places, non-Western contexts, is it not?
Yeah, but I don't think I do that. I think I actually, what I do is that I seek references outside of, first of all, of architecture, because it's there's not much there anymore, I would say. Maybe it's like there is a need to really look outside of beyond the fence to kind of think about how other disciplines have started to engage with this topic. So of course I come to Catherine Youssouf's seminal book, A Billion Black Anthropocene or None, which is more an expansion of a critique than really kind of a kind of grand tour of miserabilism, as you phrase it. So I would object that what she does is basically a takedown of geology, and I think that it's because its relation to matter is actually a very adjacent takedown to architecture as a kind of discipline that is grounded in these exploitative processes. So to me, it's more that at that point, architecture needs to look beyond itself and draw from other in a kind of respectful and inspirational way, and to kind of give thanks and give back for that, rather than kind of being exoticizing. In that case, I really don't think that this is the case. And also, I think it's also a way to kind of point at the fact that architecture itself is in fact grounded in this kind of gendered and racialized processes, because who extracts the materials that we're using, who maintains the spaces in which we live, is very clearly not your usual white man. So in that sense, I think that this is what this book is also trying to do, is like to kind of do justice to these kind of externalized processes that we, just kind of happily ignore when we practice.
It seems to me that the model that you're proposing, at its core, or one of its cores perhaps, as it's a pluralist book, maybe it's got lots of cores, is about integrating and to some degree implicating the individual designer within the processes of their production, which distinguishes it very clearly from that modernist idea of examining bacteria through a microscope on an agar plate, that alienating process of othering. Is that partly what you're trying to do? And again, I suppose, where does this come from? Is this a kind of doubling down on postmodernist subjectivity, making oneself significant at all stages and at all levels within the processes that we enact?
Right. Yeah, maybe.
Short answer.
Maybe. I think that I think you might be right on a few things about like centering the architect, or like, thinking, okay, we can do so much and we're doing so little. So I think that there is definitely that. There is a kind of, there might be a kind of replica of some of the things that are being criticized by the fact that the book is so is addressing designers as being, key to a lot of things. Typically, people would always say, well, we're trying, but we know it's so hard. And I know, I mean, as someone who's, has kind of a fit in practice, I know how hard it is. But I also think that there is this idea that architecture has been able to do so much harm that it should be able to also undo so much of that harm, right? So like, when we claim powerlessness, we're not being fair to the amount of to the impact that the profession actually has. And of course, by that, I also mean the profession being nestled within the construction industry. And there I really draw into, as, co-complicit, real estate, finance, and policymakers, and all of that. So here it's very clear that it's not just the designer's responsibility, but the kind of entire, what I refer to as the kind of, chain of production of space. No, who is basically taking decisions at every step, and all of us in that are basically in need of like being more critical to what we do. And what I find comforting is that, well, in architecture, we do have this discourse. I'm not sure that this kind of critical discourse has landed much in other places. So I'm always kind of wondering what kind of conversation real estate is having, what kind of conversation is engineering having, is there a kind of debate in the ventilation industry and things like that. So I'm always kind of like interested in how other fields are really contending with the crisis, and I'm really, let's say, adamant in making the point that construction is a chain of production. So it's something that is done by many actors and forces, and that all of them, including us as educator or as, cultural practitioner or whatever, are also part of this chain. So, there is that. So I'm interested in implicating not just the designers, but everyone. And I'm hoping that the book also finds maybe an audience outside of architecture, even though at times it's clearly addressing architects. But, for instance, the chapter that discussed the office, I don't think that what's happening in the architecture office is limited to the architecture office. I think that a lot of these kind of extractive and toxic environments happen in other places, for instance. So I hope that it can also resonate in other adjacent fields.
One last question to finish. If you were to propose a first action towards this moratorium for a particular audience, let's say student architects, people who are learning or developing as architects who haven't necessarily got a big commission or a significant commission, what would you say would be the best first thing to do? Is it read something? Is it take a walk?
Maybe it's a bit more than that. It would be understand the system. So I think it's about gaining literacy in the in the systems in which we operate. In a way, a kind of literacy of how projects are made, where points of leverage are located, what is it that you can potentially change or not change. That, of course, starts with saying no to certain things, knowing that this is a privilege that not everyone can afford, of course. But basically, the kind of acquiring knowledge on the forces and the actors that sit on the construction processes, I think, is one of the first things to do, and then really kind of interrogate whether you can say yes or no to something, and then whether you can actually make a change, or choose. It can be something very small. It can be about convincing a client not to use polystyrene insulation in a project. It doesn't have to be grand gestures. I think that this is something that also the book is trying to bring forth, is that there is also a multiplicity of actions that can be done that are not necessarily grand, but that can still lead to substantial changes. And I think there is a discursive shift generally. So I think, to sit with that interrogation is a good place to start.
Make yourself uncomfortable.
Yes, I'm still uncomfortable all the time.
That's because it's 40 degrees.
And not only. Maybe the fact that it's 40 degrees is also a good thing to tie to this discussion on construction. I mean, it's not 40 degrees by accident, right?
Great point to finish on. Thank you very much, Charlotte, for taking the time to speak with me. I've enjoyed hearing you talk a lot.
Thank you for having me.
As Ecclesiastes put it, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What does man gain by the toil at which he toils under the sun? A generation goes, and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun goes down, and hastens to the place where it rises. The wind blows to the south, and goes round to the north. Around and around goes the wind, and on its circuits the wind returns. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they flow again. All things are full of weariness, and man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. My goodness, that's good. But so's Charlotte's book, and between the two, in some implicit way, there is, I suppose, a dialogue. Thank you to Charlotte for taking the time to speak with me, and to Sternberg Press for the book. Please see the podcast description to it. You should buy it. It's very interesting, and to Charlotte's professional and social profiles. And thanks for listening.